The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge. It was one of those slow, sticky summer days where even the birds seemed to take a break from singing. Traffic moved lazily, and most folks were either heading home from work or already inside trying to beat the heat. But for one woman behind the wheel of a dark sedan, the day was far from over. She'd been up since before dawn, sitting in an unmarked car outside a warehouse on the edge of town, watching, listening, taking notes. Her job wasn't glamorous. Most days it was just waiting, patience, and paying attention to the smallest details. She worked for the FBI, assigned to the Civil Rights Division, and lately her focus had been on patterns of misconduct within local police departments. Cedar Ridge had come up more than once in internal whistleblower reports, complaints about aggressive stops, racial profiling, officers using excessive force, especially against black residents. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to warrant a closer look. Now, after 12 hours in the field, she was finally heading back to her temporary apartment. She wore plain clothes, jeans, a loose blouse, sneakers, nothing that screamed federal agent. Her badge and credentials were tucked in the inner pocket of her jacket, just in case. She drove carefully, hands at 10 and 2, speed steady. She knew better than to give anyone, even a local cop, a reason to pull her over. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because sometimes in places like this, just being who she was could be enough. She signaled, checked her mirrors, and changed lanes to pass a slow-moving delivery van. She'd done it cleanly, legally. But in the rearview mirror, she saw flashing red and blue lights snap on behind her. Her stomach dropped. She pulled over to the shoulder, heart thumping but face calm. Years of training kicked in. She turned off the engine, rolled down her window halfway, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. She didn't reach for her purse. Didn't move suddenly. She waited. The officer approached from the driver's side, boots crunching on gravel. She was a white woman, mid-40s, with a tight bun and a posture that radiated impatience. Her nameplate read Hayes. She didn't greet her. Didn't say good afternoon or do you know why I pulled you over? Instead, she leaned in, eyes narrowed, scanning the car like she expected to find something illegal hidden in the cup holder. License and registration, she barked. The woman in the car nodded slowly. Of course, she said, voice even. I'm going to reach for my wallet now. It's in my front pocket. She moved deliberately, pulling out her wallet and then her driver's license. She also took out her FBI credentials just in case, but held them folded behind the license so they weren't immediately visible. She handed the license through the window. Officer Hayes barely glanced at it. Step out of the vehicle. May I ask why? The woman asked politely. I signaled before changing lanes. My registration and insurance are current. I said get out, Hayes snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. The woman took a quiet breath. Arguing wouldn't help. She opened the door slowly, stepped out, and stood with her hands visible at her sides. She was taller than the officer, but she made herself small. Shoulders relaxed. Chin slightly down, not as a sign of submission, but as a tactic to avoid appearing threatening. Hayes circled her like a hawk, eyes darting over her clothes, her hair, her shoes. You live around here? She asked, voice laced with suspicion. No, the woman replied. I'm just passing through. Passing through in an unmarked car? No bumper stickers, no personal items. Looks like a rental. It's a government vehicle, she said calmly. I'm with the FBI. Hayes let out a short, mocking laugh. Right, and I'm the Queen of England. She crossed her arms. You think flashing some fake badge is going to scare me off? I've seen your kind before, trying to act like you're somebody just because you don't want to get a ticket. The woman didn't flinch. I'm not trying to avoid anything. I'm telling you the truth. My name is Special Agent Thompson. I have my credentials right here. She held them out slowly, opening the leather case to reveal the gold shield, the photo, the official seal. Hayes snatched the badge from her hand, glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds, then shoved it back toward her chest. This could be printed off the internet for all I know. You expect me to believe some woman driving alone in the middle of nowhere is FBI? Come on. I understand you're skeptical, the woman said, keeping her voice low and steady. But assaulting a federal officer is a serious federal crime. If you have doubts, you can call your dispatcher and verify my identity through the FBI field office in Atlanta. They'll confirm I'm active duty. That word, assaulting, seemed to ignite something in Hayes. Her face flushed red. "You threatening me now?" she spat. "You think you can come into my town, act like you own the place, and talk down to me?" "I'm not talking down to you," the woman said gently. "I'm asking you to follow procedure. If you're unsure, call it in. That's what any good officer would do. Don't tell me how to do my job," Hayes shouted, stepping closer. Her breath smelled faintly of coffee and cigarettes. "You're being uncooperative. You're resisting. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back." "I haven't resisted," the woman said, still calm. "I've complied with every request. I've identified myself. I've offered to verify my credentials. I'm not under arrest, and you have no probable cause to detain me." That was the last straw. Hayes's eyes flashed with anger, or maybe fear or shame, and without warning she shoved the woman hard against the side of the car. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Before she could recover, Hayes swung her hand and slapped her across the face, hard. The sound cracked through the hot air like a gunshot. "You don't give me orders," Hayes yelled, her voice shaking. "You don't get to stand there with your fancy talk and look down your nose at me. You're just another—" She stopped herself, but the word hung in the air like smoke. The woman stood frozen for a second, cheek burning, ears ringing. She tasted blood where her lip had split against her teeth, but she didn't cry out, didn't curse, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she straightened slowly, wiped the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, and looked Hayes directly in the eyes. "You just assaulted a federal officer," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "My name is Special Agent Maya Thompson, badge number 8842. I am invoking my rights under Title 18, Section 111 of the U.S. Code. You are now interfering with a federal investigation, and I will not be handcuffed." Hayes stared at her, breathing hard. For a split second, doubt flickered in her eyes, but then she scoffed. "Save your act. I'm cuffing you for obstruction and assault on an officer." She reached for her cuffs, but the woman didn't move. She simply said, "Go ahead. But know this, my team has already been alerted. They're on their way." Hayes froze. "What are you talking about?" "My vest has a silent distress signal," the woman explained. "It activated the moment you made physical contact. Within 30 seconds, my supervisor was notified. They know my location, my status, and that I've been assaulted. They'll be here in under 5 minutes." Hayes's confidence wavered. She glanced down the road, then back at the woman, really looked at her this time. The calmness, the posture, the way she spoke, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd been trained for moments exactly like this. "You're lying," Hayes muttered, but her voice lacked its earlier fire. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there steady as a stone watching the road, and then in the distance the low hum of approaching engines grew louder. Not one car, several. Black SUVs, no markings, moving fast but controlled. Hayes's hand dropped from her cuffs. Her face went pale. Within moments, the first SUV screeched to a stop behind her cruiser, followed by 2 more. Doors opened. Men and women in dark tactical gear stepped out, but they weren't aggressive. They formed a perimeter, calm and professional. One of them, a senior agent with silver at his temples, walked straight up to Hayes. "Officer Hayes," he said, voice firm but not loud. "Please step away from Special Agent Thompson and place your hands where we can see them." Hayes didn't move at first. She looked from the agent to the woman she'd just slapped, then back again. The truth crashed over her like ice water. This wasn't some random driver. This wasn't a bluff. This was real, and she had just hit an FBI agent on federal duty in the middle of an active civil rights investigation. Her knees nearly gave out. She took a shaky step back, hands rising slowly. I didn't know," she stammered. She doesn't have to look like anything," the senior agent cut in. "Federal law doesn't care what someone looks like. It cares what you did." Behind them, Agent Thompson finally allowed herself to breathe. She touched her cheek again, wincing slightly, but her eyes never left Hayes. There was no triumph in her gaze, only sadness, and something deeper, resolve. Because this wasn't just about her. It never had been. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in oranges and purples, the quiet road in Cedar Ridge became the starting point of something much bigger, a moment that would ripple through courtrooms, police departments, and communities for months to come. But in that instant, all anyone could hear was the hum of idling engines, the rustle of uniforms, and the heavy silence of a mistake that could never be undone. The air felt thick like breathing through a wet towel. Officer Hayes stood frozen on the roadside, her hands raised slightly, palms out as if trying to push away what was happening. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. The black SUVs surrounded her cruiser like silent predators. Men and women in dark tactical gear moved with calm precision, not shouting, not rushing, but radiating a kind of quiet authority that made her feel smaller by the second. Special Agent Thompson hadn't moved from where she'd been standing. She just watched, eyes steady, face unreadable except for the red mark blooming on her cheek and the small trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed, like someone who'd seen this before too many times, and still hoped it wouldn't happen again. The senior agent, the one with silver in his hair, stepped closer to Hayes. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but firm, "I need you to confirm. Did you strike this woman?" Hayes opened her mouth, then closed it. Her mind raced. She wanted to say it was a mistake, that she'd been provoked, that the woman had been acting suspicious, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down she knew none of that was true. She'd been angry. She'd felt challenged. And she'd lashed out, not at a criminal, not at a threat, but at a fellow law enforcement officer who happened to be black and calm and unafraid. I thought she was resisting," Hayes finally muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Resisting what?" the senior agent asked. She was standing still. She identified herself. She offered to verify her credentials. "Did she raise her voice? Did she move toward you? Did she touch you?" Hayes didn't answer. She looked down at her boots, scuffed from years of pavement and patrol. The truth pressed in on her like a weight. From behind, another agent approached Thompson holding a small medical kit. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Thompson nodded. "Just a split lip. Maybe a bruise. Nothing broken." She accepted a gauze pad and pressed it gently to her mouth. Her hands didn't shake. Meanwhile, 2 local patrol cars rolled up, sirens off, lights still flashing. 2 officers stepped out, both men, both younger than Hayes. They took in the scene, the FBI presence, the tense standoff, their fellow officer looking like she'd just seen a ghost. One of them recognized Thompson's credentials, which were still open in her hand. "Wait, that's real FBI," he said under his breath to his partner. His partner nodded slowly. "Yeah, and Hayes just hit her." The 2 local officers exchanged a look, part shock, part dread. They knew Hayes, knew her reputation, knew the whispers in the break room about how she didn't like certain types in certain neighborhoods. But this was different. This wasn't just a complaint that would get buried in a file. This was federal. One of them stepped forward cautiously. "Agent, we're with Cedar Ridge PD. Do you need us to secure the scene?" The senior FBI agent gave a short nod. "Thank you. Please ensure Officer Hayes remains here. She's not under arrest yet, but she's not leaving." Hayes flinched at the word yet. She wanted to argue, to demand a lawyer, to scream that this was all a misunderstanding. But something in the way the FBI agents carried themselves, their silence, their control, told her that yelling wouldn't help. In fact, it might make things worse. Thompson finally turned to the senior agent. "I want to file a formal complaint," she said. "Assault on a federal officer, violation of civil rights, and obstruction of a federal investigation." He nodded. "We'll document everything. Your body cam footage, the distress signal log, witness statements. All of it goes straight to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Thompson glanced at Hayes, who still wouldn't meet her eyes. "She needs to understand," Thompson said quietly. "This isn't just about me getting slapped. It's about what that slap represents. It's about who gets believed when they say they're law enforcement, and who gets treated like a suspect just for existing." No one spoke for a moment. Even the crickets seemed to pause. Then from the back seat of one of the SUVs, a radio crackled. A dispatcher's voice came through. "All units, be advised. Media scanner just picked up chatter about a federal incident on Route 17 near Cedar Ridge. Local news vans are en route." The senior agent sighed. "Of course they are." Thompson didn't look surprised. "Let them come," she said. "If this brings attention to how some officers treat people who look like me, even when we're on the same side, then maybe something good can come from this." Back at the Cedar Ridge Police Department, things moved fast. Within an hour, the chief was on the phone with the FBI liaison in Atlanta. Within 2, Hayes was officially placed on administrative leave. Her badge and gun were collected. She walked out of the station in street clothes, head down, while officers she'd worked with for over a decade avoided her gaze. At home, she sat on her couch in the dark, blinds closed, phone buzzing nonstop. Some calls were from friends. Most were from reporters. She didn't answer any of them. All she could see was Thompson's face, the calm, the dignity, the blood on her lip, and the way she'd said, "You just assaulted a federal officer," like it was a simple fact, not an accusation. Meanwhile, Thompson was at a nearby hospital getting checked out. The doctor confirmed a minor laceration inside her lip and a developing bruise on her jaw, but no fractures. "You're lucky," the nurse said as she applied a cold pack. "It could have been worse." Thompson smiled faintly. "I've been lucky before, but luck shouldn't be the reason someone walks away from a traffic stop alive." Later that night, back at her temporary apartment, she sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea, reviewing the day's notes. Her phone buzzed, a message from her supervisor. "Body cam footage is already circulating online. Be prepared." She opened her laptop. Sure enough, a local news site had posted a short clip. Grainy, but clear enough. It showed Hayes shoving her, then the slap. The caption read, "Local officer accused of assaulting FBI agent during routine stop." Comments were pouring in. Some people defended Hayes, calling it a he said she said situation. Others demanded justice. But the most telling ones came from Cedar Ridge residents, black residents, who shared their own stories. Being pulled over for driving while black, having guns drawn for expired tags, being called names, being humiliated in front of their kids. One comment read, "If this happened to an FBI agent, imagine what they'd do to the rest of us when no one's watching." Thompson closed the laptop. She wasn't just a victim here. She was a witness and now a symbol. The next morning, the FBI launched a formal criminal investigation. Federal agents interviewed the two local officers who'd arrived as backup. Both confirmed they saw Hayes strike Thompson without provocation. They also confirmed Thompson identified herself clearly and calmly before the assault. Internal Affairs reopened Hayes' old files. 2 complaints from the past 3 years. One, from a black college student pulled over for looking suspicious. Another from a black pastor stopped while driving his church van were suddenly given new weight. In both cases, Hayes had claimed the individuals were argumentative or refusing to comply. But dashcam footage, which had never been released, showed something different. Polite, confused citizens being spoken to like criminals. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. Community meetings were called. Local activists organized a peaceful vigil outside the police station, not to protest, but to bear witness. They held signs that read, "Respect all officers, including the black ones," and "If she's FBI, why didn't you believe her?" Hayes watched the news from her living room, blinds still closed. She saw Thompson being interviewed, not by a sensationalist reporter, but by a calm journalist who asked thoughtful questions. Thompson didn't rant. She didn't call for Hayes to be fired or jailed. She simply said, "I hope this moment leads to real change, not just for me, but for every person who's ever been doubted because of how they look." That hit Hayes harder than any accusation. She thought about her training, about the oath she'd taken, about the badge she'd worn with pride for 12 years. Had she really let bias, maybe even hatred, override her duty? Had she become the kind of officer she once swore she'd never be? She picked up the phone, dialed her union rep. "I need a lawyer," she said. A good one. But even as she said it, she knew no lawyer could undo what she'd done. Back at FBI headquarters, Thompson met with prosecutors. They laid out the charges they could bring: felony assault on a federal officer, possible hate crime enhancement, obstruction of justice. "We have a strong case," the prosecutor said. "The body cam, the distress signal timestamp, witness statements, it all lines up." Thompson nodded. "I'm not asking for revenge," she said. "I'm asking for accountability. If we don't hold people responsible, even people in uniform, then the system means nothing." The prosecutor looked at her for a long moment. "You know this will be ugly. The defense will try to paint you as aggressive. They'll say you provoked her by claiming to be FBI. They'll twist your words." "I know," Thompson said, "but the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard." As the days passed, the story grew. National news picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Politicians issued statements. But in Cedar Ridge, something quieter was happening. Officers started asking for anti-bias training. The police chief held a town hall, his first in 5 years. And for the first time, Black residents felt like someone in power might actually listen. Thompson didn't seek the spotlight. She went back to work, reviewing case files, meeting with community leaders, supporting victims of police misconduct. But now, when she walked into a room, people noticed. Not because she was famous, but because she represented something rare: integrity in the face of injustice. And Hayes? She stayed inside. She replayed the moment over and over, the way Thompson had stood so still, so sure, even after being struck. She wondered if she'd ever be able to look another Black person in the eye without shame. One evening, she wrote a letter. Not to the press, not to her lawyer, but to Thompson. She didn't send it. She wasn't sure she deserved to, but she wrote it anyway. I didn't see you, it began. I saw what I expected to see. And that was my failure, not yours. She folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Outside, the world kept turning. But in that small town, something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and now everyone had to decide which side they were on. The story exploded faster than anyone expected. What started as a local incident on a quiet stretch of road became national news within 48 hours. A short clip, grainy but unmistakable, spread across social media like wildfire. In it, a woman in plain clothes stands calmly beside her car. An officer shoves her, then slaps her hard across the face. The woman doesn't flinch. She just says, clear as day, "You just assaulted a federal officer." People couldn't look away. At first, some tried to downplay it. Maybe she was resisting, one comment read. "Cops have tough jobs," said another. But then the full body cam footage was released. Not by the police department, but by a local journalist who'd gotten it from a source inside the station. And the truth was plain for everyone to see. No sudden moves, no raised voice, no aggression. Just a woman identifying herself, offering proof, and being met with violence. The backlash was immediate. Protests didn't turn violent, they turned vocal. Peaceful vigils popped up outside the Cedar Ridge police station. People held candles, signs, and photos of other Black men and women who'd been mistreated during traffic stops. One sign read, "If she's FBI and you still hit her, what chance do the rest of us have?" The officer, now publicly identified after her department confirmed she was on leave, became the face of a much bigger problem. Not just one bad cop, but a system that too often protected its own even when they crossed the line. Meanwhile, the woman she'd struck kept a low profile. She gave one short interview to a national news outlet, not to talk about her injuries, but to talk about the pattern. This wasn't an isolated moment, she said, seated in a simple chair wearing a dark blazer, her bruise now a deep purple along her jawline. It's part of a larger issue, where Black professionals, even those in law enforcement, are treated as suspects first, colleagues second. Her words landed hard. Other federal agents, Black, Latino, Asian, started sharing their own stories. Being followed in government buildings, being questioned about their credentials in courthouses, being pulled over while driving home from work in unmarked cars. It wasn't just about one slap. It was about the daily weight of having to prove you belong, even when you've earned your place. Back in Cedar Ridge, the police chief held a press conference. He looked tired, his tie slightly crooked, eyes shadowed. "We take this incident extremely seriously," he said, reading from a prepared statement. "Officer Hayes has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities." But the crowd outside didn't cheer. They just stood there silent. Because they'd heard promises like this before. Inside the station, morale plummeted. Younger officers, especially the few officers of color, felt caught in the middle. They respected the badge, but they also knew what it felt like to be watched, doubted or spoken to like a threat just for walking into a room. One rookie cop who'd joined the force hoping to build trust in his own neighborhood quietly handed in a transfer request the next day. The union, however, circled the wagons. Their statement called the incident a regrettable misunderstanding and emphasized Hayes's years of service. They hinted that the FBI agent had escalated the situation by asserting authority without proper identification. The claim didn't hold up. Everyone had seen the footage, but it gave cover to those who wanted to believe the officer was just doing her job. Then came the leaks. A local reporter, digging through public records, found 2 prior complaints against Hayes. One from a Black college student stopped while driving home from the library, Another from a church deacon pulled over for a broken taillight. In both cases, Hayes claimed the individuals were hostile and refused to comply. But internal emails showed supervisors had dismissed the complaints with notes like, "No evidence of misconduct," and "Officer acted within policy." Now, with the new incident, those old files were reopened, and this time, someone was paying attention. Federal investigators subpoenaed Hayes's phone records. At first, it seemed routine, but then they found something chilling. Text messages, dozens of them sent over months to a small group chat with 3 other officers. Jokes about driving while black, mocking nicknames for frequent complainants. One message sent just 2 days before the incident read, "Saw another FBI agent today. Some lady in a nice car trying to talk her way out of a ticket." Like we're stupid. The messages weren't just unprofessional. They showed a pattern, a mindset. And that changed everything. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved quickly. Within a week, they announced criminal charges: felony assault on a federal officer, obstruction of justice, and, after consulting with civil rights experts, a hate crime enhancement under the Matthew Shepard Act. It was rare for a hate crime charge to be filed in a case involving law enforcement, but the texts made it hard to ignore the role bias played. Hayes was summoned to appear in federal court for arraignment. She showed up in a dark suit, hair pulled back, eyes downcast. Her lawyer entered a plea of not guilty. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. She didn't answer. She just walked quickly to a waiting car, head bent as if trying to disappear. Back home, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment again. The calm in the other woman's voice, the way she didn't cry or scream, just stood there like a mountain. Hayes had expected fear. She got dignity instead, and that haunted her more than any accusation. Her neighbors started avoiding her. The grocery store cashier who used to chat with her now looked away. Her kids' school called to say other parents had expressed concerns. She stopped answering the door. Meanwhile, the woman she'd struck was healing, not just physically, but emotionally. She met with counselors not because she was broken, but because she understood the toll this kind of trauma takes. She also met with community leaders, listening more than speaking. "I'm not a hero," she told a group of high school students during a quiet talk at a local center. "I'm just someone who refused to stay silent. And you don't need a badge to do that." Her words stuck with them. One student later started a youth-led campaign called Know Your Rights During Traffic Stops, handing out wallet cards with legal tips and contact numbers. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. As the legal process moved forward, public attention began to shift from outrage to expectation. People weren't just watching to see if Hayes would be punished. They were watching to see if the system would actually work. Would a cop be held to the same standard as anyone else? Or would she get a lighter sentence because of the badge she once wore? The answer would come in court. But first, the investigation had to run its course. Federal agents interviewed every witness. They reviewed every piece of evidence: body cam, dash cam, radio logs, phone records, even the GPS data from the FBI vehicle, which showed it had been traveling at a steady 45 miles per hour, well under the speed limit, before the stop. They also brought in experts on implicit bias, psychologists who explained how unconscious assumptions can shape behavior, even in trained professionals. One expert noted, when someone expects a threat based on race, they interpret neutral behavior as suspicious. A calm voice becomes defiant. A request for clarification becomes resistance. It was a quiet explanation for a violent act. Hayes's defense team knew they were in trouble. Their only real hope was to argue that she genuinely didn't believe the woman was FBI, that it was a mistake made in the heat of the moment. But the texts undermined that, and the fact that backup officers arrived within minutes and immediately recognized the credentials made it hard to claim reasonable doubt. Still, they prepared. They hired a former police trainer to testify that officers are trained to be skeptical of fake credentials. They planned to argue that Hayes felt threatened, though no weapon was drawn, no aggressive move was made. But the woman she'd struck wasn't just a victim. She was a witness, and a powerful one. When federal prosecutors asked if she'd testify, she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "not for revenge, but so no one else has to prove they're human before they're treated like one." As the trial date neared, Cedar Ridge held its breath. The town was divided. Not just along racial lines, but along lines of belief. Some believed in accountability. Others believed in loyalty no matter what. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about who gets believed, who gets protected, and who gets punished. And in a few short weeks, a courtroom would decide whether the truth was strong enough to change things, not just for one woman, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, even when they were doing their job. The courtroom was quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that hums with tension, like the air before a storm breaks. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes floating above rows of wooden benches filled with reporters, community members, and a few curious onlookers. At the defense table sat the officer, now in civilian clothes, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't looked up since she walked in. At the prosecution's table, federal attorneys shuffled papers, calm and focused. And in the witness box, waiting to speak, was the woman she'd struck. She wore a simple navy suit, hair pulled back, face calm. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint yellow, but everyone in the room knew why she was there. This wasn't just a trial about a slap. It was about everything that led to it and everything that would come after. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, we call Special Agent Thompson to the stand." She walked slowly, took the oath, and sat. Her voice was steady as she answered basic questions, her name, her job, how long she'd served. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Can you describe what happened on the afternoon of June 14th near Route 17 in Cedar Ridge?" She took a breath. "I was driving back from an assignment. I changed lanes with my signal on. A patrol car pulled me over. I complied immediately, rolled down my window, kept my hands visible, provided my license." "And did you identify yourself?" "Yes, I told the officer I was with the FBI and offered my credentials." "What was her reaction?" "She didn't believe me. She called me uppity. She said I was trying to play cop. When I asked her to verify my identity through official channels, she became angry. She shoved me against my car and struck me across the face." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge rapped his gavel once. "Quiet, please." The prosecutor held up a photo, the frame from the body cam showing the slap. "Is this accurate?" "Yes. Did you provoke her in any way?" "No, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move suddenly. I didn't reach for anything. I stood still and spoke respectfully." "Why?" "Because I've been trained to de-escalate. And because I know how quickly things can go wrong for someone who looks like me, even when I'm on the same side as the officer." The courtroom fell silent again. Even the defense attorney looked down at his notes, avoiding eye contact. Then came the cross-examination. The defense lawyer stood, adjusted his tie, and approached slowly. "Agent Thompson, you're highly trained, correct?" "I am." "You understand police procedure. You know that officers sometimes face people pretending to be law enforcement." "That's true." "So isn't it possible Officer Hayes was acting out of caution, that she genuinely doubted your credentials?" "She had every opportunity to verify them," Thompson replied. "I offered to have her call the FBI field office. I told her my badge number. I even activated my distress signal so my team would know I was in trouble. But she didn't want verification. She wanted control." The lawyer paused. "You said she called you uppity. Is that a word you remember clearly, or is that something you added later?" "I remember it clearly," Thompson said, her voice quiet but firm, "because it's a word that's been used to silence black women for generations. It means you're not staying in your place. And my place that day was as a federal officer doing my job." The lawyer tried another angle. "You didn't show visible identification right away, did you? You kept your badge hidden behind your license?" "I presented it when asked," she said, "and I explained what it was before handing it over. But even if I hadn't, assault is never the response to uncertainty." "Procedure is," the judge nodded slightly, as if agreeing. Then the prosecution dropped their biggest piece of evidence. They called a digital forensics expert who walked the jury through Hayes's phone records. Text messages appeared on a screen for everyone to see. "Another FBI agent today. Some lady in a nice car trying to talk her way out of a ticket. Like we're stupid. These people think a badge makes them untouchable. Newsflash, it doesn't. If she's so important, why is she driving through our town alone? Smells fishy." The messages weren't just skeptical. They were laced with contempt, and they used language that singled out black women specifically. One thread even mocked a local news story about a black female prosecutor, calling her acting like she owns the courthouse. The defense objected, calling the texts taken out of context, but the judge allowed them. "These go directly to intent," he said. "The jury is entitled to consider them." Hayes sat frozen, her face pale. She hadn't known the texts would be shown in open court. She'd thought they were private. Now everyone could see what she really thought. When it was her turn to testify, she sounded nervous. She stuck to the script. "I didn't know she was FBI. I felt threatened. It was a mistake." But under questioning, her story unraveled. "Did you ever ask for backup before approaching her car?" the prosecutor asked. "No." "Did you call dispatch to verify her credentials?" "No." "Did you give her a chance to explain before you touched her?" I thought she was being defiant. But she was standing still, correct?" "Yes." "And you struck her anyway?" Hayes looked down. "I regret it." "Do you regret hitting her?" the prosecutor pressed, "or do you regret that she turned out to be FBI?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Hayes didn't answer. She just shook her head and whispered, "I don't know." That was the moment the jury's minds were made up. Closing arguments came the next day. The prosecutor didn't shout. He didn't dramatize. He just laid out the facts. "This isn't about whether Officer Hayes had a bad day," he said, standing before the jury. "It's about whether she let bias override her duty. She had every tool to handle this professionally, radio, backup, procedure. Instead, she chose violence. And when she did, she didn't just hit a person. She hit the rule of law itself." The defense argued reasonable doubt, stress, split-second decisions. But their words felt hollow next to the texts, the footage, and the quiet dignity of the woman who'd been struck. Deliberations began that afternoon. Inside the jury room, it didn't take long. One juror, a retired school teacher, said she had 12 years to learn how to do her job right. She chose not to. Another, a young delivery driver, added, "If that happened to my sister, no one would believe her." But this woman had proof and still got hit. After less than 3 hours, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom gasped. Hayes covered her face with her hands. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. But the message was already clear. Even a badge doesn't make you above the law. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some held signs that read "Justice served." Others just stood quietly, tears in their eyes. Thompson didn't give a speech. She simply walked down the steps, paused, and looked at the people who'd shown up. Not for her, but for the idea that fairness matters. A young black girl, maybe 12 years old, stepped forward and handed her a folded piece of paper. "For you," she said softly. Thompson opened it. It was a drawing. A woman in a suit standing tall with the words "Thank you for not backing down" written in careful cursive. She knelt, looked the girl in the eyes, and said, "You keep speaking up too, okay? The world needs your voice." The girl nodded, then ran back to her mother, beaming. That night, Thompson sat alone in her apartment, the drawing taped to her fridge. She wasn't celebrating. She felt relief, yes, but also sadness, because this shouldn't have had to happen. No one should have to prove they deserve respect. Meanwhile, Hayes sat in her living room, blinds closed again. The verdict replayed in her head. She thought about the texts she'd sent, the complaints she'd dismissed, the faces of people she'd treated like suspects just because of how they looked. She picked up the unsent letter she'd written weeks ago, the one that began, "I didn't see you." She read it again. Then she tore it up. Not because she didn't mean it, but because words weren't enough anymore. Actions were, and hers had spoken louder than any apology ever could. In the days that followed, the story stayed in the news, but the tone shifted. It wasn't just about punishment anymore. It was about change. The Cedar Ridge Police Department announced mandatory anti-bias training for all officers. They agreed to an independent review of every use of force incident from the past 5 years. And for the first time, they invited community members to sit on their oversight committee. Thompson was asked to help design the new training. She agreed, but only if it included real stories, not just lectures. "People don't change because they're scolded," she told the chief. "They change when they see themselves in someone else's pain." He listened. As sentencing day approached, letters poured into the court, some asking for mercy, others demanding the maximum penalty. But the most powerful came from ordinary citizens. A bus driver who'd been profiled, a teacher who'd been followed in stores, a veteran who'd been treated like a threat in his own neighborhood. They didn't want revenge. They wanted to be seen. And in the end, that's what the trial had given them. Not just a verdict, but a mirror. One that showed exactly who they were and who they could still become. The morning of sentencing was overcast, the kind of gray sky that feels heavy but doesn't rain. Inside the federal courthouse, the air was still, charged with a quiet anticipation. People filled the benches, not just reporters this time, but residents from Cedar Ridge, civil rights advocates, retired officers, and even a few current police trainees who'd been given permission to observe. They weren't here for spectacle. They were here to see what accountability really looked like. At the defense table, the officer sat alone. Her lawyer was beside her, but she kept her eyes on the floor, shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself smaller. She wore the same dark suit from the trial, but it hung looser now, as if she'd lost weight in the weeks since the verdict. She hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't posted anything online, hadn't even gone to the grocery store. The world had moved on, but for her, time had slowed to a crawl. Across the room, the woman she'd struck sat with her arms crossed, calm but not relaxed. She wasn't here for revenge. She'd said that from the beginning. But she believed in consequences, real ones, not just words on a page. Because without them, nothing changes. The judge entered and everyone rose. He was a man in his late 60s with tired eyes and a reputation for fairness. He'd read every letter, reviewed every report, and listened to hours of testimony. Now it was his turn to speak. He began by acknowledging the weight of the case. "This isn't just about one traffic stop," he said, voice low but clear. "It's about trust, about who gets believed, about whether the badge protects everyone, or just those who wear it." He turned to the officer. "You took an oath to serve and protect. Instead, you let bias guide your hands. You struck someone not because she threatened you, but because she refused to shrink herself for your comfort. That's not policing. That's power unchecked." Then he delivered the sentence: 5 years in federal prison. No parole. Loss of law enforcement certification. Mandatory counseling on implicit bias as part of her re-entry plan. The officer didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, as if she'd known this was coming, and maybe in some quiet part of herself had been waiting for it. Outside, the reaction was mixed. Some called it too harsh. Others said it wasn't enough. But most people, especially those who'd lived with the daily sting of being doubted, followed, or spoken to like a threat, felt something shift inside them. Not joy, not satisfaction, but relief. Like a door that had been stuck for years had finally creaked open. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Ridge began to change, not overnight but steadily, like a river carving a new path. The police department, under pressure from the Department of Justice, agreed to a consent decree. That meant an independent monitor would oversee their reforms for the next 3 years. They rewrote their use of force policy, banned certain aggressive tactics, and made body cams mandatory for every stop. Most importantly, they created a civilian review board with real power, not just to make suggestions, but to recommend discipline. And they invited the woman who'd been struck to help train new recruits. She agreed, but only on one condition: the training had to be honest. No sugarcoating, no bad apple excuses. She wanted recruits to hear real stories from real people: Black drivers, Latino families, elderly neighbors who'd been treated like criminals for no reason. So they set up a program called Seeing Clearly. Once a month, officers sat in a circle with community members and just listened. No defending, no interrupting, just listening. At the first session, a retired schoolteacher talked about being pulled over 3 times in 1 year, all for failure to signal, even though her car had no turn signal issues. A young delivery driver shared how he'd been ordered to kneel on the sidewalk, while officers searched his van in front of his customers. Because you fit a description. And an older man, a veteran, spoke about being followed in his own neighborhood by patrol cars, even though he'd lived there for 20 years. The recruits didn't say much, but their faces said everything. Meanwhile, the woman who'd been struck kept working. She returned to her role in the FBI's Civil Rights Division, but now with a new focus: building bridges between federal oversight and local communities. She traveled to other towns, sharing what happened in Cedar Ridge, not as a warning but as a possibility. Change is hard, she'd say, but it's possible when people choose truth over comfort. She turned down most media requests. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a catalyst. One Saturday morning, she drove back to Cedar Ridge, not in an unmarked car this time, but in her own. She parked outside a community center on the south side of town, where a group of teenage girls waited for her. They were part of a mentorship program started after the incident, designed to build confidence and teach young women their rights. She walked in wearing jeans and a soft sweater. No badge visible, no title announced. Just a woman showing up. The girls gathered around, curious but respectful. One asked, "Were you scared when she hit you?" She thought for a moment. "Yes," she said honestly, "but not for my safety. I was scared that no one would believe me, that they'd say I deserved it because I talked back or didn't act right. That's the real fear, being erased." Another girl, quiet until now, spoke up. "My mom got pulled over last week." The officer didn't even ask why he stopped her. He just said, "You know why you're here?" She didn't do anything wrong. The woman nodded. "That's why we're here. So you know your rights. So you know your voice matters, even when someone tries to silence it." They spent the morning practicing what to say during a traffic stop, how to stay calm, how to record safely, and when to ask for a supervisor. But more than that, they talked about dignity, about walking through the world knowing you belong, no permission needed. Afterward, as she walked to her car, one of the girls ran after her. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Every month," the woman said, smiling, "as long as you'll have me." Back in the federal prison where the officer was now serving her sentence, something unexpected happened. She signed up for the bias awareness program, not because it was required, but because she finally wanted to understand. In group sessions, she heard stories from inmates who'd been profiled, harassed, or ignored by the very system she once represented. For the first time, she didn't argue. She listened. She also started writing. Not texts this time, but letters. Apologies, mostly. Not to excuse what she'd done, but to acknowledge it. She wrote to the church deacon she'd stopped years ago. To the college student. To others she couldn't name, but knew she'd hurt. She didn't expect replies. She just needed to say the words. One day, a letter came back. It was from the deacon. He didn't forgive her, but he thanked her for writing. "Most people never admit they were wrong," he wrote. "Maybe this is where healing starts for both of us." She folded the letter and kept it in her locker. Months passed. Seasons changed. The story faded from headlines. But its impact remained in policy changes in training rooms, in the way officers now paused before speaking during a stop, and in the quiet moments, like when a young black girl confidently asks an officer for his badge number during a traffic stop, and he shows it without hesitation. Or when a new recruit during field training says, "Let me call it in to verify," instead of making assumptions. Small things, but they add up. One evening, as the sun set over Cedar Ridge, the woman who'd been struck stood on the porch of the community center